Welcome to another episode of the Oxford Global Society podcast. You're listening to Brian Wong, who's an assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Hong Kong and also fellow at OXGS. And I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Michael Jinghan, a professor at the City University of Hong Kong and also fellow at the Oxford Global Society. A highly accomplished scholar in China studies, Michael had previously served as the director of the Confucius Institute at Lancaster University, where he was also a full-time academic. He has penned a fascinating book titled Memoirs of a Confucius Institute Director, Volume 1, on which we will be speaking today. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So I greatly enjoyed this read, in part because it fused together the personal and the academic in a way that's really quite professional and seamless. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to probe you on a more personal front for starters, and that is, to what extent did you view this book a cathartic exercise of healing? And did writing it prove helpful for you in addressing a lot of the misconceptions and undue allegations that were thrown your way by your critics and cynics during your time in the UK?
Well, I think this book, when I write it, I don't have a specific agenda. I think there was a lot of people probably has been saying a way that I wrote this book to defend Confucius Institute, or I wrote this book for something. I think mostly for me, this book, if I can achieve that, this really show a honest account of what has been happening in the past 6 years' time when I serve as a director of the Confucius Institute, and how we have achieved some success and how we managed to overcome some crisis. And I think that's all I need to do. And I think to me, this is very much a kind of reflection of what has been happening to my personal life in the past 6 year time, and how this kind of links with a wider picture of what we often talk a lot about China and global cultural diplomacy and Confucius Institute, which lies in the center of this media, academic, and political debate. So for me, I think the purpose is very straightforward. It's a reflection and an honest account of showing people what I have observed.
I want to talk a bit about definitions, and defining Confucian institutes, of course, for, a lot of the audience here. What exactly is a Confucius Institute? Do you think it's possible to define it in a way that doesn't necessarily give rise to positive or negative connotations? And perhaps that could be the foundation upon which we then sort of establish this conversation and to get our conversation going. So what is a Confucius Institute? In a sort of value neutral definition, if you will, so to speak, Michael?
Well, okay, first of all, I think the negative and positive meaning or like kind of feeling we associate with Confucius Institute depends on the political context where you are sitting, right? In many parts of the world, especially in the Western society, many of the media and the political narrative have been associated to Confucius Institute in a very negative narrative. But in the larger part of the world, in Asia, Africa, and many other places, it is a very entire different picture. So number one, this is socially constructed. And number two, there is no clear definition of Confucius Institute because they are a very different kind of way of organization and different kind of structure. So I would very much define Confucius Institute as a cultural and language initiative to promote cultural exchange between China and the host country, and also cultural understanding between China and the host country. Another thing to mention about Confucius Institute in terms of misunderstanding is Confucius Institute concept. If you really go back to it, the first one established in 2005 and in Uzbekistan, and then later Korean and west part of the world. And basically, we're talking about a concept and also an idea that have been evolving for 20 years. And then a lot of current discussion haven't really been noticing this evolving dynamics of how Confucius Institute was and is and will be. So one clear example is in 2020, in the book that I mentioned, Confucius Institute went through a fundamental transformation. Before that, it was managed and supported by Confucius Institute headquarters. So basically, you have a central agency in Beijing coordinating all Confucius Institute and supporting them. But after 2020, it moved towards a decentralized working model, which is managed by Chinese International Educational Foundation, which is an NGO and do not really provide hands-on. So the point I'm making here is the idea of Confucius Institute has been there for 20 years and it's constantly evolving, and we should really have updated knowledge about it. Otherwise, we may easily misread what Confucius really is, and that is the case in many media and political narrative in the West.
Absolutely. And I just want to, we'll return to the Confucius Institute discussion shortly, but I want to just turn to your own professional career because throughout your introduction, you highlighted the complex multitudes comprising your own identity. You're a Chinese national, you're a UK-based director, you're a manager, and you're a politics scholar, to name just four of the many hats you wear, so to speak. To what extent have you found these roles mutually reinforcing in a constructive manner? And in what ways have you found them pulling at you from different directions and pushing you to go in different directions? Can you tell us a bit more about, your reflections upon your identity or your identities in relation to each and every one of these fronts, and then some?
Well, I think this is actually a very good question, and sometimes I think the more when I write about this volume of the Memoirs and also the second volume, I start to reflect quite a bit. And as you mentioned,
Mm,
those four identities, in many ways, they are relevant and overlap a bit, but also sometimes can pull people into very different directions. So, for example, I'm a Chinese, so like the fact that I'm a Chinese national, but serving as a foreign director is confusing to many people in China and other places because
mm,
they don't know why a foreign director can be a Chinese national. They think it must be a foreign national. So to speak. So that's even the case for people in the Confucius Institute community. And I think in many ways that the fact that I am Chinese, I understand China very well, and I study in the UK and also in the US, I work there. So I have the essential language skill and cultural skill to do the job, which makes things a lot more easier. Having said that, the fact that I am a Chinese national, Chinese is my native speaking language. So sometimes I do not really understand the struggle of learning Chinese as a
mm,
secondary language, as many of our learners in the Confucius do. So sometimes those kind of identity gave me some advantage, or sometimes also took away something. And in terms of where this has been pulling into different direction, I think some of the example has been given specifically in the book. And one of the most prominent example is the way that I have been viewing things. So as an international relations scholar, we talk about,
mm,
China's rise and the age of AI and US-China confrontation, US-China, the New World Order, things like that every single day. And Confucius too sits in the very picture of it. So it provides a bigger picture and good understanding of where we should be pursuing this kind of higher educational exchange. Having said that, the day-to-day job, although relevant and sits in that, and the 99% of day-to-day job is about very institute level personnel matters, which are
yeah.
not necessarily relevant to the bigger geopolitics. And that has been splitting things of focus. So as someone directing an institute with 30 people, basically our job is to keep things going and focus on what we do. If we are looking to the sky every single day, worrying about there might be a raining or there might be a crowd coming, then you cannot achieve anything. So you do have
Mm,
that kind of split identity. And also the way that I have been saying things also very different. As a politics scholar, I might be interpreting something as quite positive and understandable, or I would be recommending that. But as an
right.
insider, as a manager, or someone who is directing it, I would argue against it. So you do see this kind of struggle and splitting identity, and which has been demonstrated in different parts of this book.
Now, these are roles that, of course, you've identified yourself in curating and also narrating your own history through this book. But for the person listening back at home, who want to get to know you and your history, could you tell us briefly, the audience that is, how would you describe your own upbringing and the story and the journey you've had thus far that's gotten you to this very point? Because that sort of personal background perhaps is incredibly helpful in helping situate, your own journey and reflections upon your tenure as a CI director as well, right? So where would you like to share with us, perhaps briefly, about your roots and your origins and how you became, the successful academic that you are today?
Right. Well, I think my personal story was very much reflecting the bigger picture. So in my generation, a lot of Chinese students aspire to study in the US and in the UK as well. And I was one of those Chinese students aspires to go to study in the US, and which I
Mm.
did. And also at that time, I think I'm very keen to this kind of cultural diversity and then cross-cultural understanding, a different kind of environment, trying to learn. So I traveled to the US for my master's degree. And after that, at that time, I studied public administration. And I very much view that as in my early 20s. I think promoting world peace is a very cool thing to me at that time. And then I choose United Nations in New York as my first destination of working. I wasn't really been planning about uh, academic career at that time. So I went
Mm.
to the United Nations and worked there for a while and realized that UN is a very different kind of organization than I originally know. And also its role in the international order are also very different from what I understand. So I decided to go to the England and further my study and trying to understand maybe politics of China and the world a bit more. And that's what bring me to the UK. And after I studied in University of Warwick for my PhD, and I stayed in a few places for my as an academic who study about Chinese politics and China in general, and then before offering this job. So I think in many ways, my personal journey reflects and also overlap with a lot of Confucius what I want to achieve. Cross-cultural understanding and bring people from different background together and understanding different cultural context, language context, and also different kind of higher educational background context. But what is probably slightly unique is that you do not really have a lot of Confucius Institute Director who is also a Chinese politics scholar, because those two sometimes tend to be interested in align or interested in against with each other. And I think that's
Mm.
what is unique about this book and what the kind of perspective I offered here.
You know, obviously your own career trajectory and pathway up till this point has meant that you've largely, by and large, worked, almost at the intersection and the fault lines, conjoining different tectonic plates of power, if you will. And at the UN, it's a melting pot, it's a smorgasbord. And inevitably, as you've highlighted subsequently in reflecting upon your more recent years, you've experienced, right, the challenge of being viewed with suspicion by not just both sides but by all sides. So maybe the Chinese think you're too westernized, and the Brits think you're too fervent and too affectionate towards China. Then the Americans think, well, you're too Asian anyways, you're not sufficiently qualified to be an impartial observer. All of these allegations and all of these sort of perceptual judgments, right? I'm sure this is something that you've experienced, and actually a small but important minority of us, right? Folks like us, we can most certainly empathize with you here. Now, you framed your responses to this sort of conditions, right, through the lenses of having an intercultural background, which quote unquote has prepared you to handle the mental shifts, right, with adaptability and resilience. What does this mean, though? What does adaptability and resilience mean in the face of, concretely folks who obviously see you through very reductionist lenses, whether it be your skin color or your political beliefs or your academic scholarship, in a way that's not reflective upon you as a multidimensional being?
Well, I think there are several angles to this. I think number one, as you mentioned, it is, I mean, you have been seeing suspicions from both ways, right? I think in the book I also talk a little bit about, and it's incredibly challenging, I think, in a deglobalized world, right? If you really go back, I think one interesting thing also in the context, if you go back to the golden era, right? We talk about UK-China golden era at the time. And the background of being a Chinese based in the UK have connections with China is being viewed as an asset. And that's something really people value and cherish. But then when the bilateral relation become worse and geopolitical tensions rise, then
Mm.
that become liability. And then your connection and being viewed suspicious, and then you become problematic, and then people will be viewing you in different kind of ways, right? But even if you are still the same person. So I think in a polarized world, it's more and more difficult. I mean, as academic in academic debate in a polarized world about China, It's more and more difficult to stay in the middle, to be neutral, because we'll be attacked by both sides. I'm sure a lot of people will share the same feeling with a similar background. That's number one. Number two, I think out of academic community, I think for all those cross-national organization, I think in a context of this geopolitical tension between China and the West, and that's what we're going to see. Chinese companies, right? Huawei and all the EV companies, etc. Cultural organization, Confucius Institute, educational organization, and I think all sorts of when you are kind of based in
Mm.
two countries where they start to have geopolitical tensions. And you were supposed to be there, stay neutral and balanced, but then that balance is harder and harder to make, and you will be attacked by both sides. So I think that's another unique kind of phenomenon to academics, but also what we are going to see for all sorts of cross-national companies, cross-national
Mm.
organization in the current world, which we have seen a lot of geopolitical tensions and seeing this kind of decoupling, polarized world order.
Right. And obviously, you speak aptly to many of the challenges, right, and predicaments that folks who engage in cross-cultural ambassadorship and also communication would inevitably experience. It's just, I sort of feel that perhaps the challenges, are often easy to intellectualize about. So we can talk about this from a distance, we can frame it through conceptual tools and frameworks and, bridging, interpositionality, doing all sorts of interesting intellectual acrobatics about it. And yet when we come to experience it, there's almost this kind of, wow, I can talk about it, but I can't apply it, in practice, kind of inertia or helplessness, perhaps, which I don't think you necessarily experience as described by a book, but I certainly think is a germane phenomenon and also salient phenomenon that many experience at large. But on that note, let us now perhaps delve into the story, that you tell in your book itself and some of the specific moments I think the readers would benefit from or the audience would benefit from hearing more from you about Michael. And the first moment concerns the pandemic per se. Now, the riveting but also very harrowing chapter that you wrote on a pandemic featured quite prominently the teachers and the faculty who staffed the institute. Many of these individuals chose to move to the UK from abroad and to dedicate themselves to teaching Chinese culture and language to students in the UK, despite some very adversarial circumstances, especially considering not just the pandemic, but the politicization of it. Why did these individuals choose to do so? What motivated them, in your view? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think what motivated them is very much similar to what motivated me, or and perhaps you as well. Why we decide to go to another country, which is in a different part of the world, to study, get away from your family, from your parents, from your, comfort zone, right? Why we go there? I think a lot of them go there, and a lot of them are committed to Chinese international education. Not only because they are really committed to the job or teaching or have or very much like the idea of cultural understanding and cultural exchange. A lot of them specifically choose the UK because of this British soft power, because they have been, learning English from very beginning and have been reading a lot of British literature and watching a lot of British films and know a lot about British society. And some of our teachers, they actually used to be scholars who study Shakespeare, for example. And for them, having this opportunity of go to the UK, not as a visitor, not as a tourist, but stay there for a couple of years and actually work in a British university, understand its culture, and being able to, communicate and work as a team. It's a very brilliant idea for those people who like this intercultural understanding thing and who are very much into the British society and like the British value, British culture, and the British language.
And of course, on top of that, I guess there's also the interesting element of doing all of this during the pandemic. As we both know, returning to China, as you said, was deeply difficult in the first, I guess, 9 to 12 months of the pandemic, with a very strict exit entry controls, huge amounts of uncertainty. And of course, morale was low, as you described, especially in the early 2022 to perhaps late 2023 period. And those 2 years were incredibly challenging. What were some of the the key sort of means and ways by which you tried to raise morale amongst your staff? And was it easy, or at a moment you thought, "Gosh, I can't take this anymore. I'm done, and I'm getting out of here"?
Well, I think it's not easy, first of all. And the most challenging time will be the first really few months, literally the first 2 months, especially in March time. At that time, I think generally speaking, on campus, the Chinese society, like Chinese students, Chinese faculty, we have read a lot about how this pandemic has been developing in China, and reading a lot
Mm,
of Chinese language news and a lot of family kind of inquiry, and also influenced by the anxiety from our family ties in China. They were saying this something very serious, be very careful, and buy mask where you can, stay away from people, right? So you got that kind of feeling this is something very serious. In the meanwhile, in the UK, generally speaking, they don't take it very seriously, and people still view that like Chinese people wearing masks is something very weird in the UK, and the NHS system wasn't really ready, and the political narrative, and even Boris Johnson wasn't really taken
yeah,
seriously, right? I mean, he was the first one of the first British
yeah,
politician, like leader in the world who got infected. So you got this kind of two very high gap of a very sensitive, very anxious Chinese community, and
yeah,
also generally public in the UK wasn't really ready for that. So a lot of them come to me for solutions and things like that. And that was where set up the context. And also in March, when the pandemic eventually spread in the UK, need to the national, need to the the
lockdown.
campus closure. I think eventually that month was probably the most challenging months. Essentially, we're seeing several problems. I think number
Mm,
one, our staff are very anxious, cannot really focus on work, and they were isolated at home, have a lot of mental
yeah,
challenge, and how are going to deal with it? Well, we don't know because normally every day people will come to the workplace, we will check out they're fine or they're not fine. Number one. And if they do not come to the work office, you don't know how they are, you don't know what they have been facing. Even if they, let's say, got sick at home, and who is going to help them, right? You don't know about this information. I think that's a thing. The third thing is if they become quarantined or they need help, who is going to do that to help them, right? And that all those are very, very practical challenge. And also a lot of them want to leave. I think when they finish the term, they want to leave. And they are unable to secure a flight tickets. And I think in this book, I talk about one specific example, a very lucky teacher who secured the tickets and were already set in the plane in Manchester, and was asked to leave the plane because she simply coughed on the
yeah,
flight. And imagining her, she already checked out of her flats and take all her luggage with her and are ready to go back home. And then was asked out of the flight and have no plan B, where she's going to live, where she's going to stay. And at home, her parents were worrying sick about her situation. So all those are very, very kind of challenging moment we're facing, and we don't know what we're going to do about it. And I think in the book we talk about some of the measures we try to mitigate that. For example, we have a weekly kind of meeting, and not always formally, but in a social way. So make sure that they got someone to talk to, so they don't have to isolate in one room facing a computer every single day, worrying about what they're going to do, and do not want to go out because there might be a possibility of contracting a virus. And also there are some other managerial kind of issue as well, because some of our team are based in local school. They continue the
right.
working even during national lockdown, but others do not. So how are you going to make sure it's fair to everyone and do not really being affecting those who are working?
Good.
So I think lots of kind of small challenge here and there. I wouldn't say it's easy. And even for me, I was very worrying about the situation, and you cannot clearly through when can you get out of it.
So I want to take a step back, Michael. And of course, those were very harrowing initial days in a pandemic that you had to contend with the whiplash and also the implications of. But on the other hand, when it came to the politics unfolding, say in Westminster and also in London, that was another storm brewing unto its own. And just before we delve into the politics of all of that, some of the most common allegations we hear, especially in, say, British or American media about Confucius Institutes is that they are bases for espionage. They are sources of attempts to infiltrate and to interfere with the operations of universities. And some would even say, they are a part of the quote unquote United Front strategy adopted by the Chinese. And all of these are, of course, accusations that you had to deal with yourself. Now, you position the book as an attempt to refute these allegations. What is your sort of 5 minutes elevator pitch on each of these allegations? And perhaps we can then take it from there, so to speak. What's wrong or what's untrue about these allegations, and what's true about them too?
Right. Well, I think it's very difficult and challenging probably to give a 5 minutes pitch of it. I think
Sure,
there are
sure,
so many
sure.
allegations. Even
Maybe
talking
just
about
focus
the
on the primary
allegations
one.
and
Yeah,
who is saying it, it might take a long time. But I think
yeah,
there are several things I want to make in this book, and also I want to leave the audience also to probably some motivation to read the book. I think
sure.
there are several types of the allegations. We'll be just doing them one by one and to give a very rigorous kind of answer rather than saying they are all wrong. And that's
Yeah,
not what my book is trying to say. So
yeah.
in some of the allegations, like spying and also suppressing Chinese students, monitoring Chinese students,
Mm,
and I think a lot of them are based on misinformation and disinformation. And I think some of the reasons I have been mentioning in the book. And some of them, others like propaganda, Chinese influence, and I think a lot of that just misrepresents what we understand as legitimate cultural activity. We now have British Council, we see operating in China, right? Also in Hong Kong as well, and also a lot of British university opening campuses in China as well, right? Working with Chinese university. And when we talk about influence, what do we mean by influence? Influence is a byproduct of interaction, right? And that's a natural thing. It's a legitimate thing when you do that. The British Council is also promoting British influence in China as well. When the British University operating their campuses in China teach in British curricula courses reflecting British value and also teaching English, are they not promoting British soft power? When we have American Hollywood movies, right, being widely watched in China, Avatar 3, I mean, I very much look forward to watching it, by the way. In many ways, promoting American soft power as well, American values as well, in many aspects, right? Is this necessarily a bad thing? Do we need a national policy to ban Hollywood movies in China, right? So I think those questions through back. I'm not saying that those allegations are wrong, but I'm saying that they're misrepresenting the legitimate cultural and global interaction, right? So that's the second type. And third type, I think depends on what we mean. I think a third type, there are some legitimate concerns. For example, to what extent Confucius might affecting academic freedom, institutional autonomy. But I have to say that Confucius Institute is just like other external fundings. In many universities, you have the funding from British government as well, British defense industry. They have the same issue that they might be there affecting academic freedom, or they might be there undermine institutional autonomy. So the argument I
Mm.
made in the book and also in my own experience is those issues are legitimate concern. But number one, do not single out Confucius Institute. It's just another one of many external fundings. Number two, this is entirely manageable. So in my experience, I've been managing, and also in this book as well, about how we are be
Mm.
able to manage the Confucius Institute in a way that this aligns of the values and integrity of the university in a way that it can address those legitimate concerns. So what I'm saying here, for those concerns, we do not need a national policy intervene in university because that is counterproductive to academic freedom. That is counterproductive to institutional autonomy. The institutions themselves can manage it well for those issues. So we really have to separate those allegations because there are too many.
No, thank you for that. What undergirds, of course, many of the allegations raised against CIs in general, and that sort of, this sort of underpinning element also indirectly responds to your, responses just then, is a kind of idea that China is different from the US, is different from the UK. Hollywood is not the same thing as Nurja 2, and DeepSeek is not the same as OpenAI, which is obviously so much more transparent than DeepSeek. I'm being sarcastic here. Anyway, so obviously there's this sort of almost like a reverse exceptionalism narrative, right? That okay, I can grant whatever you're saying, Michael, that all these other countries do it too, but China shouldn't do it because China is politically different. It is structurally distinctive from the UK. It is not unlike the US and the UK, according to, of course, many of these voices, an open and robust democracy. And therefore, everything you said might be true, but still, this does not justify in the voices or in the views of cynics the existence of CIs. To what extent do you find yourself having to deal with such challenges, especially from parliamentarians or politicians who submit the nth freedom of information request just to, dig out or uncover the quote unquote links between CIs and also, whatever it is that Beijing is pursuing as a global political agenda? Is this something that you had to contend with, the sort of, reverse Chinese exceptionalism narrative, which ironically kind of feeds off and plays into as well the more positive propagandistic Chinese exceptionalism narrative that we often see, of course, pro-China propagandists put out themselves, where they say China is special, China is unique. On the other hand, in the UK, you hear claims that no, China is special, and therefore we have to oppose CIs as opposed to letting them exist, which strikes me as by all means, a reasonable option, so to speak. What do you make of this?
Well, I think you summarized very well. I think a lot of that are very much double standard, and some of the point I think are also shared in the higher educational sector in the UK as well. I've been hearing a lot of senior leaders talking about the same thing, right? When you have British Council actively promoting across the world, operating in China, and also when you read their reports, they are very proud that they play a key role in promoting British soft power. And also the UK was very proud that it is a number one or among a top soft power country in the world. Because I mean, I do agree there's something really for them to be proud of. I mean, UK is no longer the British Empire that has been there with unchallenged hard power. And the soft power is really something that people cherish and like. And that's something why I decided to come to the UK to study, because of the soft power. So I think they are right to do that. But then I think exactly as you summarized, when it comes to Confucius Institute, oh, something's wrong about it. And also, I think in the book, I did a little bit kind of comparison. What we will find really, really interesting is the British influence in China in many ways is very high.
Yeah,
I grew up in Chongqing and I
yeah,
started to learn English. It's mandatory for all Chinese students in my generation in junior school. And you have to learn that for so long. And for you to
yeah,
enter a college, you have to pass your English language degree, right? And we read a lot of Shakespeare, watch a lot of British movies and films. So the British influence and soft power in China is very high. And then if you look at the UK and how many British students really know Chinese, how many of them know Chao Xueqing, how many of them know
yeah.
Li Bai, right? In comparison with Shakespeare, you'll see that the Chinese influence, Chinese soft power awareness of Chinese culture is quite low in the UK. And what the Confucius do is really starting from a very, very low bar. And even that, people will say, I mean, it's quite ironic from my point of view that you have very high British influence, very low Chinese influence in the UK, and they look at the Chinese influence saying there's something wrong about it. We need to stop about it, right? And
Mm,
um, hello, I think number one. Number two is a lot of those political narrative is basically about sentiment. They do not like China for sure, and a lot of them are China haters, and they just want to say Confucius is being crushed, but they do not really want to say, okay, what's a backup plan? I mean, a lot of British universities have Confucius Institute for a reason. They need to provide Mandarin program to the UK society. And what is
mm.
a backup plan? There's no backup plan, basically. So I think that is something that I have to be dealing with, I think, on a frequent basis. And the Freedom of Information Act, as you mentioned, come on quite regular basis, sometimes a couple of times every month. And a lot of them are very boring, honestly. They keeping asking the same questions. Where your funding come from? How much is the funding? And et cetera, et cetera. So you
Yeah.
basically providing the same answer to multiple different kind of Freedom of Information Act. And some of them would go as far as, I think this is a bit outline. Basically, some has been encouraging undergraduate students when they do their undergraduate thesis to get first-hand data, they will file a Freedom of Information Act on the Confucius Institute to get some feedback as a first-hand data to complete their thesis.
Wow.
Well, I would say, yeah, good for your thesis, but this is a waste of time and also administrative resources in the higher education system in the UK, but that's where we are.
Let's take a step back, because I take your point, right, Michael, in highlighting the fact that very often there's this sort of deeply seated, deeply rooted fear, consternation, concern, what have you, in reaction to China. And when you speak of China in the UK today, the kind of reception and reaction you get is very different from the attitudes you'd get 10 years ago, during what you said to be the golden period, where you had, of course, Cameron, Osborne, and to some extent, I guess, Theresa May and, Philip Hammond as well, right? That was a sort of the sunset, the dusk of the golden period and era. Fast forward 10 years, under the Labour administration that we now see, there's still a strong emphasis upon China as a strategic rival. And of course, amongst the three prior prime ministers to the current one, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and also Rishi Sunak, China, to put it mildly, was not portrayed in the most positive of light, so to speak, by the powers that be in both Westminster and also Whitehall. What exactly has been going on in Sino-British relations? And without sort of taking a perhaps sort of blame assigning stance in this matter, what are the primary causes that could explain the decline in trust, the deterioration in perceptions, and frankly, the sort of pretty rapid intensification of hostility towards China in British politics and beyond?
Well, I think there are many factors affecting this, and uh, you can say the similar patterns across almost all Western countries. And I think they remarkably sharing the same kind of pattern and also pointing to the same phenomenon. That is US-China relation. You see this kind of geopolitical tension between US and China ever since 2016 when Trump became the president. That was really a period that had been changing and shifting US-China relation and also spread across the world. And as the US special allies, I think the UK a lot of debate about Confucius Institute, about China has been reflecting that American influence in many ways. So that's, I would say, one of the most important factor. And other things is in also, I sometimes feel a little bit unfortunate that when you have in 2015, you have this UK-China golden era thing, although yes, I don't think the British society or the policy community have that consensus. It's very much a slogan held by the Cameron government. I agree. But that does show their commitment and signal, right? They have been pointing to the same direction. But then we got the Brexit, and that immediately crashed this kind of leadership who are so committed and bet so much on China. If the Brexit happens about 2 or 3 years later, that probably gives more time to consolidate this UK-China relation, or probably do not happen at all. And I think things will be quite different despite this American influence. So I think a lot of that is this kind of combination of issues. And also the elephant in the room is also a series of tensions between China and the West on a wide range of issues. You got the issue of Xinjiang, you got the issue of Hong Kong as well. I think that's play a key role between UK and China, and also South China Sea. So all of those issues kind of come out one by one, and also the pandemic. And combining all those things together, that's where we are seeing from this golden era to what Rishi Sunak will be saying anything but golden era, and to now in a way that we don't know how to summarize it.
Yeah. I think you've certainly highlighted, the sort of underlying the undercurrents, right, that really are trans-applicable across wide swathes of the West, so to speak. But just to, apply some pressure on the thesis there, some readers or some of those in the audience might say, no, there's a sui generis or distinctive elements, so to speak, that are only applicable to the Sino-British relationship. You talked about Hong Kong, of course, which has become pretty, enduring point of contention, given the historical ties between Hong Kong and the UK. But actually, another angle and perspective, that's been raised a lot in relation to a number of select technological companies from China and their actions in the UK, but also now more recently, the kind of opprobrium over of course, the Moldova embassy. You often hear allegations amongst Brits, right, that the Chinese pose uniquely threats, so to speak, to privacy, to data through espionage or surveillance and so forth, and setting aside the sort of merits and demerits of that, because that's not really the point of this conversation. How have you found dealing with these allegations that you were sort of in on this quote unquote conspiracy to eavesdrop on a UK? How did you deal with these criticisms, or you might even say mudslinging? The slinging of mud towards you, who's presiding over really just a CI at a university in Midlands, UK.
Well, I think this is probably go back to one of your first questions about my identities here, right? So as a scholar who work on Chinese politics and also international relation, you really have to engage with those allegations on a daily basis and study,
Yeah.
okay, what is the new narrative come from the US about Confucius Institute, right? This one day they designate Confucius Institute Center in the US as a foreign agent and then ban it. Other day they come with kind of spying kind of allegations, things like that. As a politics scholar, I really have to follow it and even with engage with it and intellectually, you have to engage with it and think what this means. But as a director of a Confucius Institute, and I do think that, and also a lot of my colleagues would be doing, paying too much attention on those would distract you, right? Because after all, our job, day-to-day job, as you mentioned, in the northwestern part of England, and not everybody has been following politics so closely, and they don't really care that much of political narrative. One thing
Mm.
that is remarkably interesting, I'm giving you one example, was also mentioned in the book. Despite in 2022, there was a massive campaign launched by Conservative Party, which Sunak pledged to close all Confucius in the UK. You see a lot of hostility in Westminster. And then the following year, the Spring Festival was the largest Spring Festival Chinese New Year celebration we ever organized in Lancaster and across the UK. So you still see that kind of warmth and passion and also interest in Chinese culture, and that is disconnect with this kind of
Yeah.
politics. Local people, well, especially in the northwestern part of England, they still like the Chinese culture. When we're promoting Chinese New Year in Lancaster City Council,
Mm.
you have a lot of supports, and children like it. Think about the panda, think about the dragon, think about the calligraphy. Many cases we have been politicalized Confucius Institute too much that we almost forgot what this really is about. This is really about education. This is really about language. This is really about culture. It can be apolitical at the ground level. And if you have been paying too much attention on what has been happening in Washington, narrative in London, this will fundamentally distort and distract the real work. So I think in many ways I've been fighting these two identities.
Mm.
Of one as director, I should really be focusing heads down and doing what you want to do. Do not get too distracted. And at the same time, being a scholar, intellectually engaged and following about the political narrative in the capitals and see how the things has been going.
We've talked a lot about the British side of things and the state of British politics and Sino-British relations through those lenses. But I want to now turn over to the Chinese bureaucracy, because when I was reading the section, we were talking about the renewal of the agreement and the possibility that all CIs would be closed in 2022. You exhaustively detailed the challenges of going back and forth between the Lancaster University leadership and the South China University of Technology leadership, but also dismay and expressed in private by Chinese diplomats over what they perceived to be the failure of higher education leaders in the UK to push back against politicization and avert attempts to sort of castigate any and all education dialogues and engagements. Looking back at it, what would be the biggest takeaways and upshots you drew about the Chinese bureaucracy from your interactions with these bureaucrats across different departments and bureau and divisions, you name it? What was going on there, and what can you surmise from your very, stint and dealings with these various officials in your official capacity in directing the Confucius Institute?
Well, I think there are a lot of insider stories, as you mentioned, I think in the book. And I think I'm trying to be as honest as I can, because this book, as I mentioned, I don't have a specific agenda. And I just want to have an honest reflection of what's going on. But I do think that China learned a hard lesson from a massive closure in the US. If you say about the original response from Confucius Institute headquarters to the potential of closure of Confucius in the UK. At the very beginning, they were quite angry and also in many ways hawkish to
Mm.
throw out a lot of hard words and saying that this was unacceptable. However, when you start to see this kind of massive closure, and I think they start to learn that okay, this wasn't really working, and they also start to accept the fact that this cannot be stopped and what they want to deal with it, right? So I think in many cases, the stakeholder of Confucius Institute has bringing that lesson from the US, using that to deal with cases elsewhere. And this including the cases of UK, as I mentioned.
Mm.
So the key stakeholders in relevant to Confucius Institute was not so, let's say, calmly discuss the situation and has also been foreseeing different kind of scenario what's going on. But you also got different kind of sectors, different kind of governmental functions who do not really or want to accept that to be happening in the first place.
Yeah.
So clearly, there are very diverse view about um, how to deal with Confucius Institute and how to respond it. You see that kind of different voices from China, number one. And number two, I think we see in the UK, it's the same case, but more transparent. You say within the higher education, you have different universities have different views on it. Even within the same university, you have very different view on it. And how to deal with it, you see different kind of response from different kind of Confucius Institute and different kind of university as well, as you have seen that in the US. So I find this is remarkably interesting to see and dealing with. But I think now I can talk to you in a very calm manner. But I mean, back a few years ago when I was in that situation, facing enormous challenge and the possibility of a closure and expectation from my team and such enormous uncertainty, I wouldn't be so calm and also
Mm.
so relaxed to addressing this.
Now, turning now over to the sort of summative reflections, thank you very much for that very detailed and candid account. You've framed this book as a response to and also an attempt to clarify, the truth by busting a lot of myths. What do you see as potentially valid myths, if any at all, and commonly held perceptions, so to speak, about Confucius Institutes that do in fact have, more than just a grain of truth to them? And how exactly do you think Confucius Institutes as an institution, should seek to evolve and adapt in light of these criticisms and also allegations as well? What's something that you think CIs can most definitely do in order to answer, a fair share of criticisms from fair critics?
Well, I think as a professor of Chinese politics, I think in many ways you have seen a lot of misperception about China. Um, for the Confucius Institute one, I find it remarkably interesting because it's right in the national border of Western countries. And still you have a lot of, and also being governed by the local university, you still have a lot of misperception, which is, I find remarkably interesting. In the book, I talk about the reason why most of the Confucius Institute director choose to ignore those allegations and do not want to address it. I also list out the reason why I decide to now come out, talk about it. And I certainly believe there is a lot to talk about and something need to be addressed about this misperception, right? And I think in many ways you ask me the question, okay, so what really match the reality, right? I think in many ways when we talk about the Confucius Institute potentially promoting Chinese influence, promoting Chinese soft power, and
Mm.
might be there undermining institutional autonomy. I think in many ways, those concerns are not entirely wrong. But the challenge lies in they single out Confucius as something that is uniquely different, and as if this is something not been happening or not a practice of Western governments and or Western society. And I think that is a bit is wrong, right? I think we discussed a bit about how the British university might be able to promote in British soft power in China, British influence in China. So I think those are clear there. And in the book, I talk about those legitimate concerns and how we'll be able to mitigate and address them. And I argue that this can be easily done at university level and also even in institute level, and should not be a problem that we need to escalate, that you have a national level legislation and ban Confucius Institute in the name of national security, or ban them with some extraordinary legal actions that will further invite state interference from the UK government, and it's a violation. And also, I think it will undermine academic freedom.
Right. So on that, of course, a trade-off that inevitably every university leadership these days would have to grapple with, whether it be in the US or the UK or indeed China for that matter, is this seemingly, by now inevitable trade-off to some extent between having a degree of certainty and security about one's education partnerships and the openness of said partnerships. And some might view this to be a necessary trade-off, as I've termed just then. Whereas others would say, no, it's really a false dichotomy. The concept of securitization, the push and drive towards securitization is loaded with vested interests unto itself. And then still thirdly, there's a view that openness really doesn't matter in the face of defending academic freedoms and values and, shielding ourselves from foreign influences. Where do you stand on this equation? Where do you stand on this question? Do you see this trade-off as a legitimate, competition? Or is it really less binary than people might think it is?
Number one, when I served as a director of Confucius Institute, I think what I did, and also many other Confucius directors agree, we need to be as open as possible, as transparent as possible. So we did encourage each other when we say this Freedom of Information Act, although it's very boring and sometimes asking a lot of questions which we find slightly dumb. We need to address them as much as we can and show that we are transparent, we are open, do as much as we can, right? That's something when I was a director and a manager, and we should be doing. Despite that, intellectually, I've been thinking otherwise, number one. Number two, now when I think back and also write the book, and I do think that what can be done by the Confucius Institute at the institute level can do very little to change the perception, honestly, as a scholar. That's what I'm honestly thinking. Now, using example of the Confucius Institute headquarters transition to the Chinese International Educational Foundation, right? The very idea of dissolve Confucius Institute headquarters was there to cut the Confucius Institute tie with the Chinese government, so it becomes more like a British Council way of a decentralized partnership managed by non-government organization. So from organizational point of view, this really achieved what it wanted to achieve, and the outcome is remarkably painful. This is something I want to write and currently writing about. But how much has this addressed the perception? Very little. Ever since 2020, the closure of Confucius Institute still happening in the US and many other places. In the UK, we are having the same conversation we are having before 2020, right? So although they did have a very painful and real organizational change to align the Confucius Institute with more of an international practice like a British Council and the cut the state tie, it haven't really been changed the perception of Confucius Institute. Why is that? And I think a lot is less about Confucius Institute, it's more about China. It's people's general view of China, and they imagine China will do this, imagine China will do that. We will assume that Chinese people, Chinese organization, Chinese company operating in the UK will be behaving like that. And what they actually do matters a lot less. And they can change very little of the general perception because of this wider geopolitics. So this is why I think in many ways that now when I look back, I think we did the right thing. In my role as a Confucius director, we need to be as open, as transparent as possible. But look back as a scholar, and I think it's just unfortunate
Yeah.
how many efforts you have been putting in and turning into so little outcome.
Now, coming now to, the end of this very enjoyable conversation, you've now relocated to Hong Kong, which is a stone's throw away from where you pursued your undergraduate studies in Macau. Why Hong Kong? And what plans do you have in a pipeline, whilst you're here in Hong Kong?
Well, I think in many ways, the idea of Hong Kong was very much linked to Confucius Institute. So you ask me what Confucius Institute really is. I think it is a bridge, and it is a bridge between China and the world. And the tie is language exchange, cultural exchange. And what is Hong Kong? Hong Kong is also the bridge between China and the rest of the world, a bridge between the West and East. So I think a lot of similarities in these two. And also my own academic judgment is that we are now seeing this deglobalization that is already take place, decoupling between China and the West. And this is going to last for quite some time. And in a world that China got decoupling and disconnect
Mm.
with the West more and more, and the gap is wider and wider, Hong Kong's role is become more and more crucial as a bridge because you are burning basically a lot of other bridges. And Hong Kong, because of its unique history, because of its unique background, because of its unique context, and also one country, two system, it is going to play a very unique role to bridge China with the rest of the world in the current great power politics era. And I think its role is going to become more prominent. And for anyone who are interested in this cross-cultural understanding, interested in promoting cross-cultural understanding, Hong Kong, probably I can do more in Hong Kong than I can do in the UK. And that a lot of that really has been shaping my decision to move to Hong Kong. And also I have to mention that we have a very passionate leader, and also people have very brilliant ideas and great vision that have been attracting me to come to Hong Kong.
And to be clear, the leader you're referring to is a leader of your university, or is that right?
Well, yes. I think in my university, for example, we recently created a new institute for global governance and innovation for a shared future. And also in Hong Kong in general, I think Hong Kong government and also Hong Kong are very much keen to be the bridge between China and the world, and also between the West and East. And I think a lot of that are very attractive. And we are seeing that Hong Kong is probably going to play a more important role as a platform for China to engage in international organizations and making advantage and leverage its unique
Mhm.
values. And I think a lot of that speak to my own academic past and also my career and what I want to do and want to achieve.
Well, on that very note, once again, thank you very much for joining us today, Michael. What a real pleasure. You've just heard from Michael Jinghan Zeng, who's a wonderful, wonderful author who's just published his latest collection, Memoirs of Confucius Institute Director, Volume 1, on which we'll hopefully be seeing more volumes going forward into the future. Thank you once again for your time, Michael. And you're listening to the Oxford Global Society. Please be sure to stay tuned and also follow us for more updates and also upcoming podcast episodes. Thank you.